again. This is Bill Lacey, Director of the Dole Institute of Politics, and welcome to this session of our virtual post-election conference. This session is with Mr. Joe Lenski, who is the co-founder and a vice president at Edison Research. Joe has been with us for a number of our post-election conferences, but he hasn't been with us since 2014, and it's great to have him back. So it's great to see you and good to have you back at our post-election conference at the Dole Institute.
Thanks, Bill. It's always fun to participate.
Yeah, well, let's go right into the data. We're going to cover the exit polling that you guys provide for the networks. Can you start with the description of the size and composition of the electorate?
Yeah, and before I do that, I also want to talk about some of the challenges to conducting the exit poll this year, especially in the COVID universe and the increase in by mail and early voting that we saw, which dramatically increased this year over 4 years ago. It posed a lot of challenges because there are in essence 3 different electorates that we were covering this year. We were covering the third of voters who actually voted in person on November 3rd, but we were also including the 40 to 45% of voters who voted by mail this year and the 20 to 25% of voters who voted early in person. So we in essence had to do 3 surveys. We did our traditional exit poll interviewing of voters as they left the polling place on November 3rd. We did in-person interviewing at 175 early voting centers around the country. And then we also did telephone interviews of tens of thousands of people who chose to vote by mail this year. So a lot of the challenge of the survey, putting the exit poll together, was melding those 3 sources of data into one coherent measure of the electorate. So going to your question about who voted, more people voted than ever before. 158 million plus people voted or cast a ballot for president this year. In 2020, that was more than 20 million greater than the number of voters who voted in the presidential election in 2016. And that increase was basically everywhere. Every state had an increase in number of voters, some record numbers, especially in states that were competitive and also in states where by mail voting was increased to allow for more participation from people who had fear of COVID in going to the polls. But it also showed increase in turnout across all demographic groups. So we saw typical demographics: 52% of voters were female, 16% of voters were 18 to 29-year-olds, which was a little bit of an increase from, or 17% were 18 to 29 with a 1-point increase in our trended data from 2016. We saw the continued trend of increased voting among non-white populations. According to our data, non-whites, Hispanics, African-Americans, Asians, et cetera, comprised 33% of the electorate, which was up from 30% of the electorate 4 years ago. So these were all trends that we had seen over the past few cycles. They just increased more because more people voted than ever before. In fact, the measure of voter participation as a percent of voting eligible electorate was the highest in 2020 that it had been since the presidential election in the year 1900.
Oh, wow, that's impressive. Now, we, as you know, we're particularly interested in the youth vote. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about the change in 18 to 29 voters, how much they voted, and what portion of the total electorate that they constituted.
Yeah, according to our survey, 18 to 29s comprise 17% of voters. We will see when there's more detailed analysis of the voter rolls and of census surveys that are going to take place later this year and will be reported next year, whether those trends match up with the actual voter rolls. Remember, the exit poll is a survey like any other survey. It has sampling error. This year it had challenges because of all the different voting methods that we tried to cover. But our sense was that 18 to 29-year-olds had a slight uptick in their overall composition of the electorate. Again, there were challenges there. As you know, being on a college campus, a lot of students were not at their normal college campus locations on election day, and may have voted either by mail at their homes or their parents' homes, or wherever they were attending classes virtually. So it was, and you saw this too in the turnouts in college towns. You did not see the increase in turnout at college towns that you would have expected to see with 18 to 29 turnout. And I think it's because a lot of college students were attending classes virtually and were voting in other locations than their typical college precinct.
Could you, Joe, take a moment to describe, you know, what you might define by the data as the average Trump voter?
Well, I'll tell you trends in Trump voters versus Biden voters. Trump voters tended to be more white. Biden voters tended to be more non-white. Trump voters tended to be older, tended to be more male. Biden voters tended to be younger and more female. The continuing trend that we've seen over the past decades is increase in Democratic vote in urban areas and close in suburban areas. The Trump vote increased in rural areas and small town areas compared to 4 years ago, but that's been an ongoing trend in politics over the last several decades, this divergence of metropolitan areas. And we had been seeing it in the Northeast and California. We're now seeing it even more in the Midwest and the South and in Texas, where metropolitan areas and close-in suburban areas have grown more Democratic, and rural and small town areas have grown more Republican. This also tends to correlate too with education levels, and we've seen even more of a split between how college educated voters are voting, especially in those suburban areas, and how non-college educated voters are voting more Republican and more for Trump in rural and small town areas.
What were the most important issues that you found in your exit data to the voters?
That really depended upon who you were voting on for. Among Trump voters, it was the economy and what we labeled crime and safety on our exit poll questionnaire. Among Biden voters, it was dealing with the coronavirus, dealing with health care, and also dealing with racial inequality were the top issues among Biden voters. And we've seen this dichotomy even more. It's as if the campaigns aren't even campaigning on the same issues anymore. And one of the issues or divides that we tried to measure in the exit poll this year was the divide between those in the public that want to deal with coronavirus first and then with the economy after the coronavirus pandemic has been dealt with, and those among voters that don't want to shut down the economy to deal with the coronavirus and want the economy to take precedent. And that divide was apparent between Biden and Trump voters. If you were among the 52% that wanted to deal with the coronavirus pandemic first and thought that needed priority, you were voting 4-1 for Biden. If you were among the 43% that did not want to shut down the economy to deal with the coronavirus pandemic, you were voting 4-1 for Trump. So that was the main divide on the issues that we saw in the exit poll.
One of the things that exit pollsters always do, that you guys do, is you look at candidate qualities. What qualities did voters attribute to the two candidates this year?
Yeah, that's an interesting question as well. And let me bring out the data here. And it again really varied by who you were supporting. We asked about 4 candidate qualities in the exit poll, whether they voted for their vote for president was determined by whether their candidate was a strong leader, whether they could unite the country, whether they had good judgment or whether they cared about people like me, like the voter themselves. The top item was strong leader with 33%, and those voters voted for Trump by nearly a 3-to-1 margin. But on the other end, 24% said they wanted a president with good judgment, and 19% wanted a president that could unite the country. Those were issues, the 2-to-1, 3-to-1, those voters chose Joe Biden. So again, we see this divide not only on the issues that motivated voters by party and by candidate, we also saw this divide among the candidate qualities. Obviously, Trump was promoting a brand of leadership that was strong, decisive, while Biden's reaction to especially the coronavirus and the rhetoric that's going on was more about uniting the country and trying to overcome the partisan differences that are out there. And you saw that in those choices that the voters made on candidate qualities.
One of the interesting things that jumped out to me in reviewing the exit data was that Trump voters were largely motivated by his position on issues, where Biden voters were largely motivated by his qualities. Can you go into that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, we asked. Let me bring that question up here. We asked a question about that. What was your main motivation in voting? Was it voting for your candidate or against his opponent? And the one driver there was President Trump. His voters were voting, making an active case, voting for their candidate, while a large number of Biden voters were voting for Biden in opposition to Trump. So Trump was the driving force in this election, regardless of whether you're voting for him or against him. And in terms of overall approval of Trump, we had 38% say they strongly approve of Donald Trump's job as president, and 96% of those voted for Trump. At the same time, we had 39% saying they strongly disapprove of Trump's job as president, and 97% of them voted for Biden. So nearly 3/4 of the voting public that we interviewed had a strong polarized position on Donald Trump's administration as president. And that was the driving force for most voters.
Yeah, I was going to ask this later, but you set it up perfectly. So would your view be that this election was essentially a referendum on the president's performance?
I think for the vast majority of voters, it was. And it's clear that Donald Trump ended up receiving just under 47% of the popular vote this year. Nationally, he received just over 46% of the popular vote. 4 years ago, the vote share for Trump never really moved. And what we saw in the exit polls was a small difference between his job approval, which we actually had at 50% in the exit poll, and his personal favorability, which was only at 46%. And the difference in the election from 4 years ago was that there was 6% of voters voting third party. Those were often people that had a negative view of both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in 2016. There was not the same number of people that had a negative view of both Donald Trump and his opponent, Joe Biden, this time. And so the non-Trump voters were much more able to coalesce around Joe Biden this year because of the lack of strong third-party options, and also the lack of negativity towards Biden, even among those that had unfavorable opinions of Donald Trump. So that 46%, 47% base voter for Trump that we saw in 2016, that we basically saw in the midterm elections in 2018 in our surveys then, and also in terms of his favorability in our exit poll, was basically the number he received in 2020.
What did the exit data tell you about voters' attitudes about the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it had a lot of effect. And in fact, you could probably make the argument, and I've heard it made by people, including Donald Trump's own former campaign manager, Brad Parks-Scow, that a better handling or a better sense that Trump was handling the coronavirus pandemic would have probably helped him win an election. It was that close that the difference between Trump's approval on issues like the economy, where his job approval remained pretty strong, but his overall the overall evaluation of voters of his handling of the pandemic was probably the difference in his not winning re-election this time. As I said earlier, when asked whether the priority should be handling the coronavirus pandemic or the priority should be not shutting down the economy, that difference was 52% for handling coronavirus first and 43% for not shutting down the economy. That basically matched how people voted on that. When we asked which candidate could handle the economy, it was a dead even race. 49% thought Joe Biden could handle the economy better. Donald Trump got 49% on that question. So without the coronavirus, a more typical presidential election where the economy would be front and centered and candidates would have been evaluated, Donald Trump on his record of handling the economy and Joe Biden on his proposals to handle the economy, that would have been a dead even race. But you add the addition of the coronavirus and the mostly negative evaluation of Trump's handling of it and the disruption that caused, and that was a lot of what contributed to Biden's small but decisive edge nationally.
Share some of the nuance. You got into the economy a little bit, but share a little bit more of the nuance on that issue and how it affected the election.
Again, I said, and we saw this in pre-election polls. We saw it in the exit poll. The Donald Trump has consistently gotten higher marks in job approval on the economy than he has gotten on most other issues or on his presidential approval as a whole. And as I said, that small difference between how he, when we asked handling the economy, it was a 49-49 evaluation. When we asked about handling the coronavirus, more people thought Joe Biden could handle the coronavirus better. That margin was 53% for Biden and 43% for Trump on handling the coronavirus. So there was definitely a difference in enough voters' minds on how Trump was handling the economy in general, but how he was handling the coronavirus in specific that made up a lot of the difference in the vote for Biden.
Okay, one of the areas that you looked at was candidate temperament. Speak to how the voters regarded both of the candidates in terms of their temperament.
Yeah, that was a question we had asked in 2016, and we asked it again. This is the question: do you think Joe Biden has the temperament to serve effectively as president? We also asked, do you think Donald Trump has the temperament to serve effectively as president? And Biden was the victor on that measure. 54% said Joe Biden had the temperament to serve effectively as president, but only 44% of voters said Donald Trump had the temperament to serve effectively as president. And that was after seeing Donald Trump serve as president for 4 years. So that number increased slightly from 2016, but it was still a minority view of only 44% of voters that Trump had the temperament to serve effectively as president. So, I mean, we didn't ask specifically about Donald Trump's tweets on the exit poll or stuff like that, but just this measure of temperament, I think, was an evaluation of the public that was just not the style and approach that a majority of voters wanted in their president after seeing 4 years of Donald Trump.
One of the things that I always find very interesting about exit data is when you ask the question, was your vote more positive for your candidate or more negative against your candidate's opposition? How did that stack out in this election?
Yeah, again, most voters tell us they're positive, but much about their candidate, but many more of the Trump voters said they were making a positive vote. The Biden voters were much more split, and a good chunk of the Biden voters, more voters than Trump, were voting against their opponent. So again, as I said earlier, Trump was basically driving everything in this vote. Trump's job approval was a driver, Trump's favorability was a driver, Trump's temperament was a driver. Also among those that had seen enough for 4 years, that was the driving force behind the support for Biden. It'll be interesting to see whether those voters that achieve that goal of voting against Trump, whether they will remain as positive for Biden once Biden is president and starts making decisions as president. But the driving force behind that vote was antipathy for Trump.
And what was the president's overall job approval and favorability among the voters who participated in your exit polls?
Yeah, as I said, his job approval was 50%, which meant there was enough voters out there that if this were on his overall job approval or a job performance or his job performance on the economy, might have been enough to have him eke out a small victory. But his favorability rating, as I said, was only 46%. His temperament rating was only 44%. That, in the end, was more of a personal decision that Trump was not acting in a way that a majority of voters wanted to see as president. And that could also explain some of the small but distinct differences we saw between how Republican candidates in down ballot races for Senate and House performed slightly better, not a lot. There was a large correlation between the Trump vote and Republican vote for Senate and House, but there were a few places where Republican House candidates and Republican Senate candidates outperformed Donald Trump. Most notably, Susan Collins in Maine saved her seat. She was the only Republican senator to win in a state that Joe Biden carried. We also saw half dozen to a dozen Republican House candidates win in races, especially in suburban races or more rural districts where they outperformed Donald Trump as well and gained House seats for Republicans. So it wasn't a big difference, but that difference between Trump's 46% favorable rating and his 50% job approval rating was probably enough to save Republican Senate and House seats down ballot, but not enough to carry the day for Trump, especially in the battleground states like Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania.
Okay. Then another, Joe, obviously we had a lot of advanced voting either by mail or in person in this election. How did time of vote decision affect the outcome?
It didn't affect it by much because of two factors. One, 2/3 of voters voted before Election Day, either by mail or in person at an early voting station. So the number of voters that were actually voting on Election Day was less than 1/3 of voters. In 2016, it was 60% of voters voted on Election Day. That had been dropping. That's been a trend over the years of more early voting, but this year there was an even bigger spike because of the reaction to coronavirus and the promotion of by mail and early voting in many states. So that only 1/3 of voters. So the number of people that could make their mind last minute was very small compared to 2016. There were only 5% of voters that said they decided on Election Day or in the weekend leading up to Election Day. And that compared to 13% in 2016 that had made a last minute decision. So also there was more last minute news in 2016 when it came to the Comey letter and other events leading up to the election at last minute, while there was tons of news in 2020. We had a year with impeachment, a pandemic, the death of a Supreme Court justice, disruption to the economy, Trump himself getting COVID and being hospitalized a month before the election. But most of the public opinion was pretty stable the entire election. We do see in our data more people that decided in September were more likely to vote for Biden, and those that decided later slightly to Trump, but not enough to affect the overall margins that much.
Okay. Joe, that's pretty much it for what I was there anything else that stood out of interest to you in the data, or anything else you'd like to share?
Yeah, well, I also want to talk about how the votes were counted on Election Day, because that's been that was a controversy that we knew going into Election Day, with so many voters voting by mail and voting early in person, and how those votes were being processed differently in different states, that we knew that was going to affect how votes were being reported on Election Day. So we saw states like North Carolina and Florida and Texas that processed their by-mail ballots very quickly show a Biden edge early in the night, but then as the Election Day vote was counted, Trump overcame that edge and ended up winning states like North Carolina, Florida, and Texas. The reverse happened in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where the Election Day vote, which favored Trump, was reported first, and then the by-mail vote, which was reported later in those states because it was processed later, ended up putting Biden ahead. And we saw that in our surveys. People that told us they voted by mail, in some states, it was 2 or 3 to 1 supporting Biden among by-mail voters. But those that voted on Election Day nationally supported Trump by 20 points or more over Joe Biden. So we saw that in our surveys. We saw in the pre-election data. We have seen it in the states that have broken out their by-mail vote versus their Election Day vote since Election Day. And it also affected kind of the perception of the vote count. In those states that processed the by-mail vote later, it looked like there was a dramatic change in the vote as it was being counted. And it wasn't a dramatic change at all. It was just the processing, the order of processing of ballots. So if you were in a state where the by-mail ballots were processed later, you saw these increases for Biden, because Biden voters were much more likely to vote by mail, and Trump voters were much more likely to vote in person on Election Day.
Well, then, kind of to sum it up, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I've made some notes as we've gone through, and you've given this excellent analysis. It seems to me, based on what you said today, that it was a referendum on the president, and that his 2 big problems were the pandemic and his demeanor. Is that a fair assessment of what you believe the exit data shows?
Yeah, I think that's clear. And it's also clear that the increase in turnout, the 20 million voters that voted in 2020 that did not vote in 2016, more of them came out to vote for Biden. Also, third-party voters that rejected both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016 were much more likely to vote for Biden this time. So while Trump was able to maintain that same percentage of the vote that he had in 2016 and maintain those numbers even in support of his handling of the coronavirus, that was never a majority of the population, and he was never able to increase that share of the vote, and that was just why he fell short in the critical states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona.
Joe Lenski, Edison Research, you've joined us for a number of these. It was great to see you again and have you be part of this.
I hope we can do it again, and I hope in future elections they're a little more normal than 2020 was.
Yeah, I would hope so too. So thanks to everybody for joining us for this session, and we really appreciate Joe taking the time to do it, and hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day. Thank you very much.